This is The Meaningful Way. I'm your host, Luke Iorio. It seems like the place today to start is simply this thought. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. This quote in wisdom is attributed to Einstein and serves as the basis of our conversation today as we dive into our brains and how our two hemispheres are greatly shaping our individual worlds and even our society. When I ran across Iain McGilChrist's work, I became fascinated by the implications and the understanding of it, how our faithful servant, our rational mind, may well be getting ahead of itself and maybe even running amok in our lives and beyond. Iain McGilChrist is a psychiatrist and writer who practices in London and now lives on the Isle of Skye, where he continues to write and make a living by lecturing. He studied at Oxford, received his fellowship at All Souls College, and while he was there, he discovered and decided the mind-body problem was the most interesting question in philosophy, and as a result, trained in medicine and practiced psychiatry with an interest in the interface of mind and brain. He is a widely published author on literature, philosophy, and medicine, and is best known for his work, The Master and His Emissary, which is how I came to know his work, which is extraordinary. Iain, thank you so much for joining us here on The Meaningful Way.
Oh, well, thank you for asking me here, Luke.
So I thought maybe one of the places to begin was when you got introduced to this mind-body problem, as it were. I'm just curious, what was it that drew you to it that was so fascinating that said, this is what I want to concentrate my work on?
Oh, I can tell you quite easily, really. I was, at the time, studying English literature, of which I'm enormously fond, and it struck me there was something odd going on in that people who lived before us had taken pains to produce beautiful things that were absolutely unique. If a certain poem hadn't existed, we couldn't have thought of it, or even if a certain kind of style of writing hadn't, we couldn't have thought of it. So it was unique. It was also specifically a poem is a poem. You try to paraphrase it, it's rather like trying to explain a joke. It dies. And it's also something that requires to be seen as concrete, that it is something that's not just an abstraction like a few ideas. It's something that actually affects you. You can sort of feel it in your frame, in your physical frame. And we know that art has physical effects. So I thought there was something very odd here. This thing, a poem, which was in itself unique, concrete, and depended on being implicit, we came along as critics and turned it into something full of general abstractions that you could have found anywhere. And so, as a result, the work remained unexplained. And it seemed to me that part of the problem was that, like everything else nowadays, we'd over-cerebralized. Instead of seeing this work of art as something that engages not just the brain, but the whole of one's being, one's emotions, one's body, and one's spirit, or soul, a very unfashionable term, but one I don't think we can exactly dispense with. So those were really the reasons I got interested in him. Then went to the philosophy seminars and listened to what philosophers had to say about it, and I'm afraid they were just too disembodied. So that's why I ended up thinking I need to know more about, embodied minds and brains.
I think that it is interesting to watch the way that things are evolving right now, and the attention to integrating what all of these different fields and studies have to offer to us in the way of understanding, as opposed to simply pursuing one over the other. And I think that's interesting because of the way that you talk about how essentially we've become fragmented through our hemispheres and the way in which we see the world. But for us to get into that, perhaps you could just begin. The name of your work that is most well known is The Master and the Emissary, and that comes from a brief story that was in Nietzsche. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that story and what it offers to us as to what has begun, what has happened in the way in which we use our brains and what seems to prevail at this point?
Yes, I think it was one of those the penny drops moments when I read this. Really, it's quite a simple story. In many ways, it's a bit like the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. That there was a spiritual master who looked after a small community so well that it flourished and grew, and after a while he found that he couldn't look after all the needs of the people on his own. And he saw something even more important, not that he just couldn't, but that he mustn't get involved with certain things if he was to be able to maintain the overview of everything that made sense. So he appointed his brightest and best, his best supporter, to go about on his behalf and do some work. But this very bright second in command was not quite bright enough to know that he didn't know some very important things. And so, mistaking his cleverness for the wisdom that the master had, he acted like he was a master, and went about wearing the master's cloak and so forth. And as a result, this otherwise flourishing community fell into ruin. It seemed to me a parallel with something I was seeing in the world now, which is that there's a kind of clever cynicism which thinks it knows everything but is not aware of what it is it doesn't know.
So how now let's start to break this down, because I know initially you start talking about some of the misconceptions that have been spread about what does the left hemisphere do, what does the right hemisphere do, and you were correcting some of those misconceptions. So I was hoping if you could clarify a few of those things, but also then start to give us a picture of how the left hemisphere views the world as opposed to how the right hemisphere views the world.
Okay. Yes. Well, the trouble with this topic, and it was something I had to battle with quite a bit to begin with, was that certainly my colleagues mostly thought I must be mad for talking about this topic because it had become rather toxic. It was considered nonsense and pop psychology because of a lot of the very mistaken things that have been said on the subject. And the first thing I had to do was clear the ground. And in fact, for the sake of your listeners, may I say that if you think you know what the right and the left hemisphere are like, unless you've read my book, you're probably mistaken, because most of the preconceptions are wrong. The right hemisphere is not a sort of airy-fairy and unreliable. It's actually much more cautious and much more grounded than the left hemisphere, which tends to jump to conclusions. And it's actually less intelligent. I mean, literally less intelligent. If you have brain damage in the right hemisphere, it will reduce your IQ more than brain damage in the left hemisphere. So that's a surprise to some people. Those sort of things were part of the problem. And then to try and sort of give you a very quick oversight of the difference here, it's important to know what I see as the really basic point here, which is that for Darwinian reasons, creatures need to be able to do two things that are contradictory at the same time. One is to pay very narrowly focused attention to a detail, for example, a seed on a background of grit that they've got to quickly pick up, or a twig for a nest, which requires swift, accurate perception of a detail. But if they're only doing that, they won't last very long, because while they're getting their lunch, they become somebody else's. They need to keep a vigilant overview of the whole scene so that they can look out for predators and they can look out for their mates and so on. So these are two conflicting things to do with your awareness of the world. They're very difficult to do at the same time. And indeed, if we didn't have two hemispheres that took these different views of the world, we wouldn't be able to do them simultaneously at all. So all the creatures that we've looked at, birds and reptiles and mammals and so on, have this sort of a distinction. Now the rest follows from that. Because if you have a rather fragmentary, detailed perception of this point and that point and the other point, you see the world as made up of tiny bits that then have to be stuck together to try and make sense of it. Whereas if you see the broad view, the sustained, vigilant view, then you are actually in touch with the world out there. You're not remote from it anymore. You're part of it, and you see how the whole thing coheres. So what you end up with is a situation where if you were really to rely overmuch on a certain way of thinking that your brain will underwrite for you, namely that of the left hemisphere, you see the world as made up of tiny fragments that don't really have much meaning on their own. It's hard to see how they cohere. The left hemisphere is also always fixing things. If you imagine trying to catch prey or to pick up food, you need to have it sort of fixed. And the left hemisphere, on the other hand, the right hemisphere, I should say, sees things as connected and flowing. The left hemisphere sees things as abstract, and it has to make things explicit, and it sees them in general categories, whereas the right hemisphere sees unique things, embodied things, and understands the implicit, like sense of humor, the beauty of metaphor, the poetry, and so on. So you can see how this connected with my earlier thought about what was going on in the academic world, that things had become too abstract and general and disembodied. What I was seeing here, when I understood how the two halves of the brain work, was that one of half of the brain, the one that actually doesn't have speech, it has capacity to understand language, very importantly, but it can't actually control the voice, so it can't say anything explicitly, is the one that is understanding the world truly. And we've lost that. We used to be more in touch with that. But since the Enlightenment, the last couple of 100 years, there's been a relentless drive towards the idea that the most explicit, the most rationalistic way of looking at the world is the only one that matters. And my point is not that we can do without reason, for God's sake. We all need it, and I thrive on it myself. But we need to have it in balance. It needs to be both the master and the emissary. So we come back to that idea that that kind of thinking is a good tool to use from time to time, but it's not a good way to construct a vision of the world.
Well, and I think this is where, as I started to get into that background and that information to understand the way that it works, when you then began to connect it to, and I loved one of the analogies that you used, which is as if we were sitting in a room full of mirrors, because there's this interesting trap that the left brain, his left hemisphere, has set for us, which is how things just consistently get reflected back to us. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to some of the traps of the left hemisphere when we let it run amok and we do not balance it with the right hemisphere perspective.
Yes. Well, what I meant by the Hall of Mirrors was that partly this thing that we don't see how to go beyond what it is we know. There was an interesting article by Stanley Fish a few years ago called "Does Reason Know What It Doesn't Know?" And that's the problem, is that a purely rationalistic mind thinks it can see everything, and it can't break out of the idea that it's got it all there. But what it's actually got is a lot of abstractions, a lot of images, a lot of simulacra, if you like, not a real world, but one that reflects back to us what we put into it. Now, if you can contact the world beyond the one that we construct in our heads, and in a minute I can say something about how we could do that, but if we can do that, then we begin to realize that we don't only encounter ourselves in this world and our thoughts. We can actually make links with, in fact, we don't even need to make them because they're already there. They just need to be realized, between ourselves and the natural world, between one another, and with, and they go across time too, so we're parts of cultures and so on. We're not these atomistic little rationally acting, maximizing one's benefit kind of individuals that so often we're told we are. We're deeply embedded in communities and in families and in a kind of loving relationship with one another. And it's only when we get to be to think of ourselves as competitive in a sort of rather naively Darwinian way that we end up losing that sense.
Well, I think it was interesting because you've also you tied that, and part of what you're expressing here is that we've, for so long, especially in the West, pursued this self-interest, and even while things such as affluence have increased, well-being has not, happiness has not.
Exactly.
And so I was wondering if you could then speak to more of the I guess that socialized side of it, as well as the relational aspects that the right hemisphere introduces, because that's a lot of what you began to talk about realizing these links, recognizing the community, recognizing what's there. So I guess the question being, what is it that the right hemisphere is bringing to us that the more that we touch into it, it's actually starting to deliver to us what we're really, truly after?
Well, I see the two hemispheres, if I had to put it in a soundbite, as creating two kinds of a world. And the right hemisphere is the one that is really in touch. It's really the one that's observing what's going on and understands. The left hemisphere manipulates. And you need to manipulate things in this world. You need, when I say manipulate, I mean things like lifting a knife and fork. Not necessarily manipulating other people, but that's part of the same instrumental way of thinking. So we've got into a very instrumental way of thinking that we somehow are like consumers of life. That we grab and take what it is that takes our fancy. The trouble is that we don't get any happier doing this because none of this has any meaning anymore. They only have meaning when they are already embedded in a life, in a network of things in which our spiritual eyes are open as well as our intellects. And that's really what I feel we're missing, is that people think it's not clever or smart. Only a stupid person would think that we were anything other than these really almost like robots, is the way it's put across. I mean, you even get quite clever people. I mean, and only probably a professional philosopher could be this stupid, believing that, we don't have consciousness. That's one of the great triumphs of Western civilization. We've finally reached a point where people believe we're not conscious. So what we need to do is to stop all the busy thinking, stop all the busy dissecting, stop all the constant chatter and input and stimulation, and practice being, which is more difficult than most people think. A lot of people nowadays don't even like to be quiet. I mean, they get frightened if there's not some noise or sound or something. Right. One of the reasons I love being where I am on the Isle of Skye is that it's entirely, when it's dark, it's dark. When it's quiet, it's quiet. And when you step out, you somehow feel yourself to be in touch with, it sounds a very corny thing to say, but I can't find any other way of saying it, you're sort of in touch with this planet, with this world that is our home. And that's what we're losing so much. We're rushing around all the time, pursuing money. For what purpose? I mean, if it does not even make you happy.
Yeah. Let me ask, because this is, well, actually, there are several things I'd love for you to go into further, but let me just start then with this, which is, to you, what is being? Being? How many program series would you like? No. Well, I do think that we can, I mean, we can only say a few simple things, but I think it's mysterious. I mean, I think that the old point that the really serious question is, why is there anything at all? What does it mean that there is anything? Because if it was just a meaningless chaos which had no kind of cohesion and no sort of shaping forces or anything of that kind, then nothing really would be. So I think that getting to the stage where you realize just how extraordinary it is that
that we are and that the world that we come into contact with is an extraordinary thing. But we can make our being richer or poorer. And what I'm really saying is, it seems that there's a paradox. We've become terribly affluent, but we're probably the least happy and the most restless and certainly the most destructive of the planet as a civilization of any that has been. So we've sort of become rich in one way, but poor in another. We've drained the meaning from our world by not seeing it in this way that I would say the right hemisphere helps to put us in touch with, if we have a sort of balanced view.
Well, perhaps I'm curious your reaction to this, because one of the things that I just connected to in what you were saying is that when we are being, it just is. Our environment just is. We just are. And it is kind of, I guess, living being into that space. And what that takes is a disconnection from judgment.
Yes.
Right? So the more that we're judging, the more that we're labeling, the more we're breaking it down, the more we're tapping into the left hemisphere and beyond and go and take down that route, which disconnects us from that moment. And I'm just curious that's what I was drawing out of what you were saying. And I'm just curious in your reaction and me reframing that back to you.
No, I definitely think that. And when people say, well, what is it that can be helpful? I mean, one of the things that obviously I think you're touching on there is probably the cultivation of mindfulness, in the sense of not judging and thinking about, but actually being in the world we're in. So I think that, yes, that's something we've lost. We've lost the habit of being still. We've lost the habit of being open and receptive. I have a sort of view that things come into being through a coming together of an open, receptive space or attention field into which they can come. And that sort of half draws them into being, if you know what I mean. It's not just that things sort of whiz around like billiard balls pushing one another, but things also attract. And even an empty space can be attractive. And this idea is present in Buddhism, and it's present in fact, in Christianity, and I believe in all the religions that I know anything about, which is the idea of the creativity of what seems to be nothing. We have to call it nothing, but it's really the opposite of nothing. It's a fullness that is a potential that is ready to come into being. And our job in living is somehow to actualize that in a way that is as good, as beautiful as we can.
That is a wonderful perspective, and it is just a very profound connection to the variety of the spiritual traditions that you just mentioned, of that recognition that when we see that space that is somehow in front of us, that it is in fact not nothing. It is the potential for everything, and the perspective of being able to live in that space, to be able to create, to be able to bring forward through our means, through what matters to us, and who we are uniquely, to actualize that potential is a beautiful perspective.
Yes, well, I think that's what living is. It's a matter of a potential being actualized, much more beautifully put by Keats, who called the world a vale of soul-making. But I think what he meant was it's always a process. I'm writing a book that I don't know if my publisher will like the title, but I want to call There Are No Things. And it's really about how we're obsessed with the idea that there are bits and things and material that have to be sort of stuck together to build up something. Whereas, in fact, what matters is, I don't really think the things are real. They're a useful heuristic. They help us get around in the world. But what is real is a constantly growing, flowing, evolving creative process. And you find this in philosophers like Bergson and Whitehead and others, but perhaps we won't go there right now.
The piece then, maybe if you could share a bit more of what are some of the, whether it be principles or practices, that help us continue to balance this left and right hemisphere so that we can see more of that space, see more of that flowing process that's unfolding, and not just break it down into its parts and miss the whole? So what are the principles and practices that can help us be more in that space?
Yes. Well, a general point, one has to stop doing what one's doing wrong before one can start doing something right. And it's no good, as I know as a psychiatrist, often when people come to me, I know already very quickly really what it is they need to do. There's actually no good saying that. Yeah. When I was naive, I used to, but it's hopeless because they're not ready yet to understand it. They have to have brought themselves to the point where they can. So the key thing is to recognize that a lot of the things we're doing are not in themselves helpful or helpful, and so there's therefore something quite creative in just stopping doing a lot of them. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think questioning pretty much every assumption one has is a very good habit. Stand it on its head. Whatever it is that you think is true, try turning it upside down and arguing for it. This is about freeing up your mind of all the clutter, all the furniture that's in there, so that there is a space in which you can move and dance. Yeah. But you can't do that if the room is full of unhelpful furniture. So questioning what you assume, stopping doing many of the things you do, and creating a space for something to grow, because you don't need to make it happen. You need only to create a space in which it will happen of itself. We keep thinking we should have a plan, we should make this happen, and so on. I've lived long enough to know that practically everything that you think is certainly going to happen doesn't. Most of the things that you plan, they go in some other direction altogether. And that the key is to be able to open yourself to that process instead of thwarting it and thwarting yourself in the process of trying to stop it. So it's about a kind of open, receptive, attentive, quiet, centered, grounded way of being. And there are practices that help, and mindfulness is one. I think being in touch with nature is terribly important. It's not helpful news for people who live in the middle of big cities, but I just do think that there's plenty of evidence that we think and feel quite differently when we're in the natural world. Mm-hmm. I think that listening to music is very important. I do mean listening to it, not having it on in the background. I think reading poems, sitting with a book of poems and savoring the poems as you read them to yourself aloud. I think all these activities bring one in touch with parts of oneself that are driven out by all the busyness of our lives. Yeah. And I can't remember who it was. Oh, I can. It was a German philosopher called Pieper, but he said that busyness is laziness. Making yourself busy all the time is a way of running away from the real hard work, which is also the enjoyable business of leading a life. Yeah.
Yeah, how much would be solved in the world if we would only allow ourselves and learn to be comfortable sitting in a room quietly by ourselves.
Absolutely.
Right. And so I guess the one of the images, maybe it's because of the references to art that just keeps coming back in my mind of where you began that, was almost as if we have filled up our canvas, but almost mindlessly filled up our canvas with what other people have told us and what our left hemisphere has told us needs to be there to make sense of things. And it's almost like we're cleaning the canvas back, and through that through that self-inquiry, letting go of the attachments, accepting more of the blank space, of the open space, and then using these other mindfulness and nature and music and poems to see what's left and see what we want to put back and let it just unfold.
Exactly. And it will happen without a huge effort. You just need to create the circumstances. Now, a plant, it doesn't require you to make it grow. It grows provided things don't crowd it out. All you really need to do is to create the space, and things start to grow.
That's a wonderful image.
And that's I'm just looking out at my garden, but it's not just about gardening, it's about life.
Absolutely. Well then, Iain, the name of this show is The Meaningful Way, and one of the things that I love asking our guests is just simply, what does living a meaningful life mean and look like to you at this point?
A lot of meaning has come into my life through letting go of things that I thought were important. I think being open to the things that are around one, friendships, art, nature, these things nourish one and give meaning to life without one having to sort of restlessly search in the left hemisphere way for what's the meaning, what's the meaning. You can't find it by pursuing it. What you have to do is invite it into your life by creating the right circumstances for it to happen. You don't know what it will look like until it materializes. And that's one of the things that I've learned is that, a lot of the things that I thought were very important and gave life meaning aren't the things that do at all. Yeah. So, not an easy formula, but then I think if I'd given you an easy formula, I would have sold you short.
Iain, I want to thank you so much for joining us on The Meaningful Way and sharing all of the wisdom and insight that you've shared with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me along. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And for everyone, I guess, just to be able to take a look at the things that you pursue, the things that you're trying to constantly understand, and instead begin to invite some space back in. Don't strive to understand, don't strive for the next goal, but instead to question some of the things that you've pursued, question some of the things you've come to understand, some of those assumptions, and begin to simply create space for yourself and invite life to come in and unfold and provide and show you the meaning itself. And with that, I want to thank you as always for dropping in on us, and until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for tuning in to The Meaningful Way. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and please subscribe and follow along with all these great guests, their stories and interviews. Also, it helps us a lot if you not only share some of your favorite episodes online, but also provide us feedback. Go into iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast app happens to be, and rate the show. Provide us some feedback and let us know how it is that we're doing. If you want to learn more about what we're up to, whether it be with the IPEC Coach Training School, the Live, Lead, Play Network, or even just what's evolving with The Meaningful Way, go on and head on over to lukeiorio.com.